This is U.S. History Lecture 3.6 on the 1990s. The 1990s is going to be dominated. This is just a brief introduction by the Bush administration, who I'll refer to as Bush 41, differentiating it from Bush 43. Bush 43 is George Walker Bush, and Bush 41 is George Herbert Walker Bush, the elder and the younger, I suppose we could call them. The Bush 41 is going to be dominated really by two things. First of all, Operation Desert Storm, which was the first U.S. military intervention in Iraq back in 1991. And the second is Bush's fiscal policy. We'll go over the inheritance of the Reagan administration, how Bush tried to deal with it, and why it was one of the factors that cost him the election and made him a one-term president. And then, of course, the 1990s is going to be dominated by Bill Clinton, who will be from 93 till 2001. And we'll look at a couple of things on the foreign policy realm. We'll look at the Clinton Doctrine, which we'll go over in detail. On the domestic side, we're going to go deal with two things. First is what is sometimes referred to as Clintonomics. Clinton will represent a more centrist position, which is what will get him elected twice. And so we'll look at that in some detail, and then we'll look at the scandals for which the Clinton administration is famous, the two most famous of them being the Whitewater scandal, which happened before he was president, and, of course, the Monica Lewinsky whole I did not have sex with that woman problem that ultimately will lead to his impeachment, or at least impeachment proceedings. He'll be acquitted, and we'll go over that. Now, in terms of Bush foreign policy, we have four things that we're going to look at. We're going to look at Operation Desert Shield and Storm. Operation Desert Shield is the commitment of U.S. military forces to Saudi Arabia after the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. Then we'll look at his relations with the State of Israel, which were fairly strained, and will be another of the main factors costing him the election in 92. Of course, Bush is presiding as president when the Soviet Union collapses. The Soviet Union will cease to exist on the 25th of December 1991, and we'll look at how Bush deals with that, and then we'll look more with the Clinton administration at what that means for the United States going into the new millennium. And then we'll look at Bush also, because Bush is going to ratchet up what will be referred to as the war on drugs, which it should probably parenthetically be added, the United States loses rather ignominiously, or at least is losing rather ignominiously. And the penultimate conclusion of Bush's episode of the war on drugs will be the invasion of Nicaragua to oust Manuel Noriega, who was working as essentially a money laundering operation for the Medellin and Cali cartels of cocaine dealers and distributors in Colombia. Now, in terms of Operation Desert Shield and Storm, first we have the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, and just a little bit of background here. Of course, we covered at some length in the 1980s the Iraq-Iran War and the United States' position in that war. Well, after the war ended, the United States found itself in a very difficult position because during the war, they had largely supported the Iraqi war effort in an effort to curtail the expansion of the influence of the Islamic Republic of Iran. The problem is that after the war, Iraq emerges from the war with the largest army in the Middle East, and they are still technically at a state of war with Israel, since the 1967 conflict. This presents the United States with a significant problem. Now, tensions between Iraq and Kuwait continue after the ceasefire and ultimate peace treaty in the Iraq-Iran War in '88, largely because we discussed in the last lecture that during the war, the Gulf states, Kuwait being one of them, transferred the revenues from their oil proceeds to the Iraqi war effort. And we talked at length about why they were doing this. Well, after the war, all of the Gulf states, with the exception of Kuwait, forgave that Iraqi debt. Kuwait did not. Kuwait insisted that all that money that it had given Iraq was loans. Okay, the Iraqi Republican Guard served effectively as auxiliary forces defending the Gulf states against the Islamic Republic, who wanted them all dead. And after the war, Kuwait demands its money back. This is kind of interesting because it's kind of like after the mercenaries do their jobs, you then demand your money back from them. But at any rate, uh, and in a series of negotiations from 88 to 90, things will go nowhere. Now, we have to understand that Iraq, after the Iraq-Iran War, has been devastated. They have effectively no infrastructure. Their infrastructure, in fact, Iraq will never, to this day, to current time, will never recover from the Iraq-Iran War. It hasn't yet. Its petroleum industry, which is its number one moneymaker, is devastated during the war. Its infrastructure is devastated during the war. And it has no capacity to pay back any of the money. They don't have enough, largely because of the crippling of their petroleum sector. They don't have enough money flowing in to be able to repay any kind of debt. And so Saddam Hussein, who is president of Iraq and in charge of the Ba'ath Party at the time, will enter into negotiations with Kuwait, and they really get him nowhere. Okay, and so what's going to happen is Kuwait is going to begin to engage in certain activities, essentially to get their money back. The most famous of them is lateral drilling. The Ramallah oil field is the largest oil field in that area of the Middle East, and it lies between Kuwait and Iraq. Kuwait and Iraq split the Ramallah oil field. Kuwait will begin laterally drilling, which is when you drill down and then over into your neighbor's territory, and begins to take the oil out. This is a violation of international law. Now, on the 25th of July, 1990, Saddam Hussein will call in the new U.S. ambassador. Remember, the U.S., we talked about this in the last lecture, that the United States reestablished full diplomatic relations with Iraq in 1984. Well, the ambassador was a woman by the name of April Gillespie, and Saddam calls April into his office and says, April, we got problems with Kuwait, okay? What you have to understand is that I can't, this is Saddam Hussein speaking, I can't repay Kuwait. The Kuwait refuses to negotiate on the matter. The only thing I have at my disposal to settle this issue is a 1 million-man army. At the end of the Iraq-Iran War, the Iraqi army military was a little over 1 million men. And the Republican Guard itself, which is really the only effective force that Iraq has, had swollen to about 250,000 men. And he says, if Kuwait continues to insist and stonewall on these negotiations, I'm gonna have no choice but to settle the issue through military force. To which April Gillespie gives Saddam a very cryptic message. What she tells Saddam is that it's okay because the United States is neutral on inter-Arab disputes. Kuwait and Iraq, both Arab countries. The United States official policy is that they are neutral on inter-Arab disputes. Now, Hussein takes this as a green light to invade Kuwait to settle the issue, which he will do on the second day of August 1990. After which, the Bush administration goes ballistic, okay, and engages in Operation Desert Shield, because the concern is that Hussein is now going to take the Iraqi forces and invade Saudi Arabia and the rest of the Gulf. Of course, based on what the United States knows, there's absolutely no possibility of this taking place. This is not what the threat is, and this is not what the issue is. But the Bush administration, from a very early time, and his successor, his son, Bush 43, will undergo the same basic idea, becomes convinced that Iraq is the greatest threat to U.S. interests in the Middle East. And begins to look for an opportunity to knock Hussein off, to knock the Ba'athist Party out, okay? Which is one of the reasons that that April Gillespie may have given Saddam Hussein this kind of cryptic message. The United States will go to the Security Council and get resolutions 660 through 667 passed, which call for the Iraqi withdrawal from Kuwait. 666 will sanction the use of force to expel Iraq from Kuwait, and the United States will begin to engage in this. This is now the fall of 1990, and the United States will finally be in position in January of 1991 to launch the operation. During the negotiations, okay, and one of the things kind of we see in these negotiations, it's one of the interesting things that I cover in American foreign policy. What we see in American foreign policy throughout is a fundamental lack of understanding of what constitutes negotiations. The United States believes that diplomacy is do what we say or we're going to blow you up. That's about as far as U.S. diplomacy goes. And so the Bush administration insists that through the fall of 1990, it's pursuing a diplomatic solution. Well, what the diplomatic solution the United States was pursuing with Iraq was withdraw from Kuwait or we'll attack. That's not really a diplomatic solution. That's an ultimatum. There's a difference. Okay? Saddam Hussein at one point comes up with a diplomatic solution. He says, all right, look, we got 2 UN resolutions on the books. We got UN Resolution 666 that says, I got to get out of Kuwait. We've also got Resolution 242, which says that Israel has to withdraw from territories taken in the recent conflict, referring to the 1967 conflict. Okay? So to Hussein, this is a wash. I'll get out of Kuwait when they get out of the occupied territories. Now, of course, this is a very difficult thing. You really can't entertain this on a diplomatic level because all you've got to do then is begin grabbing territory to force other states into withdrawing from their territories. So this is a difficult position for the Bush administration. The Bush administration, of course, will immediately flatly refuse any linking of these two UN Security Council resolutions. They flatly refused to link Resolution 666 and 242 and to link Iraqi withdrawal from Kuwait to Israeli withdrawal from the occupied territories. Okay? The diplomacy will, of course, break down because the diplomacy never really existed in the first place. There really was no interest in a diplomatic solution. The Bush administration, from the instance, really from its inauguration onwards, wanted to knock Iraq off. Okay? And so the diplomacy was just window dressing. It was just for show. And now with UN sanctioning behind them, the Bush administration launches Operation Desert Storm, which lasts really from January through March. It lasts for about 6 weeks in early 1991. And the ground offensive itself only lasts for about 4 days. The remainder of it is just airstrikes. He tries to pulverize the Republican Guard with airstrikes, and it's not terribly successful. Okay? For the most part, the Republican Guard just gets out of the way. Now, the thing is that the Bush administration moves in, and it takes about 4 days before Iraq agrees to the Security Council resolution and to withdraw from Kuwait. And the Bush administration comes under considerable, both then and now, okay, even retrospectively, people look back and wonder why when the United States military had its forces there and there was this UN sanctioning and a multilateral force there, why they didn't just move forward and knock out the Ba'athist regime. Well, there's a number of reasons for that. Most notably, as historical retrospect will show us, knocking out the Ba'ath regime of Saddam Hussein would unleash forces in Iraq which would be at best problematic and difficult to control. This, of course, will come out to the light of day in 2003 when his son will invade Iraq and actually knock out Saddam Hussein and the Ba'ath regime, which leads to an insurgency that really, in all intents and purposes, is continuing to this day with IS and whatnot, and we'll deal with that when we deal with the discussion of current history and the new century. Okay. Now, on to other matters. So, during the, for lack of a better term, diplomacy of the fall of 1990, as I just mentioned, Saddam Hussein links UN Security Council Resolution 242 to UN Security Council resolutions dealing with Iraq's invasion of Kuwait. The Bush administration flatly refuses to entertain any kind of linkage between these two issues. But shortly after Operation Desert Storm, shortly after March of 91, the Bush administration begins to play a rather odd game with Israel. And at one point, the Bush administration threatens Israel with the withdrawal of U.S. government support, okay, for loan guarantees. The way it works is the United States gives Israel foreign assistance. Israel is the largest recipient of U.S. foreign assistance. And the United States government also, this is in addition to the foreign assistance, guarantees loans from U.S. banks and other foreign banks that lend money to Israel. Okay? Well, there was a $10 billion loan on the table that was to be guaranteed by the United States government. In other words, if Israel didn't pay it back, the United States government would pay it back. And the way things typically work, just kind of as an aside, Israel very rarely pays back on these loans, and the U.S. government has to pay it back, and it doesn't get counted in foreign aid. So Bush threatens to withdraw the support for this if Israel continues building settlements on the West Bank. Under the conditions of UN Resolution 242, the Israelis not only were not supposed to build new settlements on the West Bank, they were ultimately supposed to withdraw from the West Bank. And so the building of new settlements kind of went in the face of UN Security Council Resolution 242. So the Bush administration decides to play a little hardball. Well, the problem with this is this will turn domestic support, particularly from the largest foreign policy lobby in the United States, AIPAC, the American Israeli Public Affairs Committee, this will turn them against the Bush administration. Okay, AIPAC traditionally takes a very hardline position and supports the Likud government, which is the hardline government in Israel that's opposed to giving up land for peace and is opposed to UN Resolution 242. And so AIPAC withdraws its support from the Bush administration and throws its support into the Clinton administration. Okay? And so this is going to be one of the factors that's going to cost Bush the election. In fact, it's probably the larger of the two factors. We'll deal with the other factor when we get on to domestic issues. Bush is going to raise taxes despite his promise not to, but presidents have raised taxes before and not lost re-election. No president has ever gone against has taken any kind of a harder position with Israel and won re-election. That's suicidal. The aftermath of Operation Desert Storm, okay? A series of UN Security Council resolutions will flow after Operation Desert Storm because the United States becomes concerned that Iraq is developing weapons of mass destruction. That's only one part of it. That's not the entire thing. Okay? But the Bush administration, this is Bush 41, was committed from the beginning to reducing the capacity to project force of the Ba'athist government in Iraq. Okay? For a variety of reasons, the Bush administration couldn't go in and unseat the Ba'athist government in '91 when they introduced Operation Desert Storm. Okay, among them was international opposition. If the Bush administration had stressed this issue, he would have lost a good deal of international support amongst it. The French. The French refused the idea of going in to unseat the Ba'athist government during Operation Desert Storm. So the Bush administration is now going to go to the United Nations with a series of proposed resolutions, most of which will be adopted, to limit Iraq's capacity to rebuild after the Iraq-Iran War and to project force, both internationally and within its own territory, and sanctions to reduce Iraq's capacity to develop any kind of weapons of mass destruction. At the time, a couple of things happen here just kind of by way of background. In 1988, in the last days of the Iraq-Iran War, the Kurds in the north of Iraq, sensing that the Iraqi government was weakened by the war, rise up in rebellion against the Ba'athist government in Baghdad. At the time, of course, Iraq is war-weary after the Iraq-Iran War. They've been beaten up by Iran for the last 8 years. And so they have little conventional force to actually deal with this rebellion by the Kurds in the north. And so Saddam Hussein will make the decision to use sarin gas against them, which is a violation of international law. The use of any chemical weapons is a violation of international law. They'll use sarin gas against the Kurdish rebels in the north with devastating consequences. It will ultimately be one of the reasons that the United States uses, both for passing UN sanctions against Iraq in the 1990s and for the ultimate invasion of Iraq in 2003. Okay? In addition, Iraq will be forced under the sanctions to disassemble its nuclear program, its chemical weapons program, etc. They will impose a no-fly zone that prohibits Iraq from operating fixed-wing aircraft. Okay, north and south into the Kurdish zone or into the Shia zone. The limitation of the use of fixed-wings aircraft in the north will give rise to the Kurdish opposition. The Kurdish opposition has existed since the early 1970s and late 60s. This will accelerate their development. Okay, and they'll recover very quickly from the devastating attacks in '88 and begin a rebellion again against the government. This rebellion will actually spill into Turkey, where they've been in rebellion as well. Okay, but that's a little too tangential. And that's why I say down here at the bottom, the rise of the PKK. The PKK is the main Kurdish opposition insurgent group. They operate in Iraq and they operate in Turkey both. And then in the south, you have the Shia zone of Iraq, and because of the limitation on the ability to project force in the south, because they can't fly fixed-wing aircraft in the south. Fixed-wing aircraft are airplanes, are interceptors, attack craft. They can still fly helicopters, but they can't project a lot of force with just helicopters. Because of that, Iranian influence will increase in the south, particularly in the Basra area. And that kind of concludes the foreign policy of the Bush administration. Now on to Clinton. First, we'll go over the Clinton Doctrine. Okay? Now, the Clinton Doctrine is based on a entirely logical, but entirely erroneous conclusion of the geostrategic position of the United States after the collapse of the Soviet Union. From 1947 onwards, the basic understanding that everybody operated under was that you are dealing with a bipolar geostrategic environment. You have two polar actors, two dominant players, the United States and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the US and the USSR. Well, does it not then follow logically that if the USSR collapses, if it ceases to exist, that the United States will be the only polar actor remaining? Doesn't that make sense? And therefore they'll be in a rather hegemonic position, a dominant position, okay, where they can dominate world politics. Okay, well, this is the premise that the Clinton administration is going to build the Clinton Doctrine on. Okay, now obviously this is erroneous, and it will become clear to the Clinton administration really by the end of the 90s that this is an erroneous conclusion, and Bush 43, when he takes over, will not operate under the same delusion, and neither will the Obama administration, that the United States is this monopolar actor, this hegemonic force. Okay, and that's because what becomes clear is that, and we talked about this at great length over the last few lectures. Everything in Epic 3 has talked about this at great length, so there's no reason to really go over too much of the background. Okay, but while the United States was devoting all of its attention and all of its resources towards containing and rolling back the Soviet Union, okay, which we talked about all the way from the Truman Doctrine through the Eisenhower Doctrine and the Nixon Doctrine and the Reagan Doctrine, okay, while the United States was busy devoting all of its resources to that, two other major international players were rising up. The European Union, which is allied to the United States and is has a close working relationship with the United States, and more importantly, the People's Republic of China, which we'll deal with in the final lecture, in this lecture on current history. But those both are rising up, And so the United States really isn't going to constitute a polar player. The other thing that rises up really in the 1980s and then throughout the Clinton administration is in international relations an extraordinarily bizarre chimeric animal, which we won't talk about in any great length. It's really reserved for international relations classes. It's what's going to rise up to an unprecedented level are non-state actors. A non-state actor is a player in the game of international politics that is sovereign, meaning it recognizes no higher earthly authority, but has no territorial boundary, no defined territorial boundary. We've dealt with them a little bit. We've dealt with them from time to time. The Palestine Liberation Organization is really a non-state actor, then and now. But what's going to rise up is a whole series of them. And when we deal with this lecture on the new century and current history, we'll deal with some of these groups that are in the news all the time, okay? Groups like Boko Haram and Al-Shabaab. These are non-state sovereign actors. And what's also going to rise, kind of just as an aside under the Clinton administration, is both multinational organizations and non-governmental organizations. But we won't deal with those. That's really restricted for international relations. And so, given the premise that Clinton enunciates this doctrine under, he tries to define for the role of the United States that the U.S. will become the world's policeman. Okay, and what the Clinton administration is going to do to an unprecedented level is seek multilateral agreement and multilateral action for U.S. actions. Okay, it's what's referred to down there at the bottom as multilateral activism. Okay, in fact, everything that the Clinton administration does internationally is going to first seek the endorsement of the United Nations, with the exception of one thing. After the bombing of the Cole, the Clinton administration will unilaterally, without seeking anyone's approval or without any coordination or cooperation with any other country, will launch airstrikes on Afghanistan and the Sudan. This will be the first U.S. military intervention in Afghanistan, and it will just be in airstrikes. It will, however, be against the Taliban regime. The Taliban regime will take over in Afghanistan in '96, I think I've mentioned before. The first use of the Clinton doctrine will be in the Haitian crisis of 94 and 95. And without getting into too much of the background of this crisis, the first elected government, and there's questions from international observations concerning the election of the Aristide government in Haiti. But in the first actual elections that they hold, the first elected government will be Jean-Bertrand Aristide, will be the president. He's going to be overthrown in a military coup. The United States immediately opposes the government that has overthrown it, okay, and will issue sanctions, etc., against Haiti. We'll go to the UN Security Council and get sanctions passed against Haiti. And Haiti can ill afford sanctions. Haiti is the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. The Clinton administration will threaten the use of force. Will get the permission of Congress because he'll get, under UN Security Council Resolution 940, it will set a historical precedent, actually. It will be the first UN Security Council resolution that sanctions the deposition of a member government. Okay? In other words, it's the first time that the United States Security Council is going to sanction deposing the government of a member state. Okay? Which significantly redefines the role of the United Nations. It significantly redefines the mission of the United Nations. And it really starts to bring up what we're going to talk about a little later, what's called R2P, the right to protect. But at any rate, on the eve of the military intervention, as the Marines are on their way and as a multilateral force is on its way to overthrow the Haitian government agrees to a negotiated settlement, a settlement that was actually negotiated by former President Jimmy Carter. And actually, that's one of the interesting things, is that Jimmy Carter, as I think I mentioned when we were talking about the Carter administration, Jimmy Carter becomes much more, former President Carter becomes much more effective after he's out of the presidency than when he was president. Okay, I suppose because he doesn't have the restrictions of having to deal with Congress. Who knows, right? But among other things, he'll go down there just before the invasion. He'll go to Haiti and deal in direct negotiations with the military government there, and ultimately get them to agree to step down. They'll step down, and Aristide will be brought back, and that's right on the eve of it. So the U.S. military force is actually never necessary. It's the threat of the U.S. military force that gets them to do it. And as the Marines are just about to land, their mission changes entirely. Their mission ceases to be overthrowing the government and reinstalling Aristide, and it becomes peacekeeping and implementing a diplomatic solution to the crisis. Okay? Which is going to be really, among another thing that we talk about in American foreign policy and international relations more, is it's also going to redefine the role of the U.S. military. This will be the first time that the U.S. military is actually used in a diplomatic mission. That their job is going to be more diplomatic than military. Okay. The almost simultaneously with this, okay, is Somalia in 1993. Now, real quickly, by 1993, Somalia had become what we refer to as a failed state, meaning that it could not, the government in Somalia, in Mogadishu, which is the capital, could not fulfill the basic functions for which a government is established, among them being protecting the welfare of the people of that country. Okay? In point of fact, by 93, Somalia had degenerated into anarchy. The government could not project force and could not keep the peace. And so what happened, Somalia is a tribal society, as many of them are in that area and in sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East. And so it had degenerated into this multilateral system of warlords, tribal warlords, the most powerful of which was Muhammad Aidid, okay, who actually at one point calls himself president of Somalia. And so the Clinton administration decides to go in there, and this is a perfect example of the Clinton doctrine, to go in there and act as a police force and establish order in Somalia. Now, the Clinton administration will bill this to Congress as a peacekeeping operation. There's a problem with that. There's a problem with the idea of peacekeeping versus, how I would say it, peace establishing or peace restoring or peace maintaining. Okay? Well, not so much that latter one, but peacekeeping presupposes that peace exists, that fighting does not exist, okay? And you're going to keep the peace. Most UN peacekeeping operations until 1993 are of this nature. You establish a peace treaty between two opposing factions. The United Nations is then put in there to keep the peace. So the idea of this being a peacekeeping operation is, at best, a stretch of the imagination. Okay? At worst, it's utter nonsense. Okay? But the Clinton administration is going to introduce the Marines in there and special forces in there in a multilateral operation. The United Nations Security Council will sanction the operation. So there's no problem there. The problem is that the Clinton administration gets into Somalia, and the situation very rapidly gets out of control. The insurgent groups against which the Marines are placed in Somalia are extraordinarily mobile. Okay? And so the Marines have very little opportunity to bring sufficient firepower to bear to neutralize them. And so the Clinton administration, it rapidly gets out of control. And as it gets out of control, we will have the second invocation of the War Powers Resolution. If you remember in the previous lecture on the 1980s, we dealt with the first invocation of the War Powers Resolution, which had been passed in 73, which we covered in the lecture on the 1970s. Okay, it was introduced. It was invoked in 1983 after the bombing of the Marine barracks in Lebanon, in Beirut, during the U.S. intervention in the Lebanese Civil War. Well, it's going to be invoked again here. The Clinton administration didn't get permission from Congress. Okay, as commander-in-chief, he's allowed to devote military forces. Particularly, this is in pursuit of a UN Security Council resolution. But under the War Powers Resolution, if they're going to be placed in harm's way, he needs to get congressional approval. Well, he hadn't done that. Okay, and it's unclear whether or not the Bush administration really believed that the Marines were not being placed in harm's way. But in point of fact, they were clearly in harm's way. This will become clear as the Marines move into Mogadishu to try to establish order in the capital. They get engaged in house-to-house street fighting with a number of the insurgent groups, most of them in coalition with Muhammad Adid. Okay, and then we'll have the very famous, which is made famous in a movie, Black Hawk Down, the shooting down of an American helicopter and the taking hostage of the crew there, and the rescue attempt to get there, to retrieve them, which they do successfully, or at least partially successfully. Well, Congress will see all this and say, look, Bill, we let you go along with this. We went along with this and let you have your head on this because we didn't think we thought you billed this to us as a peacekeeping operation. But very clearly, this is not a peacekeeping operation. You're putting U.S. military force in a hostile environment, which means you got to get our approval. And the fact of the matter is, we're not going to give our approval because shortly into the operation, it became very clear that the mission of the Marines was a very difficult one. That it was more political than military, and Congress didn't want any parts of it. The whole thing smelled of another Vietnam-like quagmire or another Lebanon-like quagmire. So Congress withdrew any support. They never gave support to the Clinton administration. So Clinton will have to withdraw U.S. forces from Somalia. Perhaps the most famous and most time-consuming and most brilliant operation by the Clinton administration, and I'll explain what I mean by that, was the exploitation of the Balkans crisis in the 1990s. Now, first, before we get into the details of the crisis, we'll deal with what's going on between the United States and the European Union in the early days of the Clinton administration and the last days of the Bush administration. Okay? In 91, the European Union passes the Maastricht Treaty, and we have no need to get into the details of the Maastricht Treaty. But one of the provisions in the treaty called for the European Union to ultimately develop its own military force. Okay? That was committed to the defense of Europe and the security of the members of the European Union. Now, the problem with this is from 49, with the formation of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, and we've talked about before, until 1991, European security was guaranteed by NATO. Okay? So the idea that the Europeans would develop their own military force would make NATO rather redundant. Okay, meaning it's unnecessary. We already have a threat to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization because specifically the North Atlantic Treaty Organization was created specifically for the purpose of preventing Soviet incursion into Western Europe. Well, the Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore. Because it doesn't exist anymore, it seems rather moot to have an organization committed to preventing their incursion. You see what I'm saying? Okay? So if the European Union had developed its own military organization essentially to replace NATO, the United States wouldn't be part of it. This would marginalize the United States as an international player. Here the Clinton administration is trying to be the world's policeman and operating under the premise that the United States is the dominant world power. Well, if the Europeans develop their own military force, that's going to marginalize the dominant world power. That's going to mean the United States is no longer necessary in the defense of Europe. So the Clinton administration is going to redefine the role of NATO, and the role of the United Nations, for that matter, in the Balkans crisis. And we'll see how he does that. Now, just a little bit of background. We don't want to get into the quagmire of the Balkans crisis. But Yugoslavia was a confederacy. Yugoslavia was actually formed after the First World War. It was a confederacy of a number of the multi-ethnic groups in the Balkans that at one point were all under the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which ceased to exist after World War I. They formed themselves into this confederacy, and after World War II, pursuant to the Yalta Conference, they came more or less under Soviet influence. Their president Tito, their long-standing president Tito, had tried to balance the Soviets and the United States, and it's kind of an interesting game in international politics, a little beyond our scope. He's never really successful. He really becomes more or less a Soviet satellite, although it's a little bit of an overstatement to say he was a Soviet satellite. He wasn't a Soviet satellite in the sense that Poland or Hungary were, but still, his main contact was with the Soviet Union. Well, as the Soviet Union begins to diminish in its influence in the late 80s, ultimately ceasing to exist in 91, the Yugoslav Confederacy loses its main sponsor, okay? And more importantly, in the late 80s, President Tito, who's chairman of the Yugoslav Communist Party, dies. And Tito was truly one of the political geniuses of modern times. He managed, for a little better than 20 years, to maintain the balance among the multiple ethnic groups in Yugoslavia and keep the Confederacy together. Well, when he dies, he has no successor that can do that. Okay? And so one by one, the multi-ethnic groups will begin to try to break away. The Confederacy itself will disintegrate. Okay? The first of this will happen in Slovenia and Croatia. Bosnia and Herzegovina will just about simultaneously. All of it happens simultaneously. Even Kosovo, which finally comes to its climax in 1999, will begin its efforts towards independence in the early 1990s. Montenegro, Macedonia, all of them will begin to express a desire to break up. Okay? Now, when this begins, and it really begins with the inauguration of the Bush administration, when this begins, it's coincidental to Bush 41 taking over. The Bush administration expresses the position of the United States, takes a foreign policy position on it, which is in favor of the Yugoslav Confederacy, okay, maintaining the Confederation. There's a lot of reasons for that, okay, which we won't really get into. The main reason is because if you don't do that, okay, one, you unleash forces in the Balkans that are difficult to control. Okay, it has every possibility of degenerating into a large-scale civil war that could spill over into neighboring areas. That's one reason. The other reason is something that we'll talk about just a little bit later, when we talk about the redefined role of the United Nations and some of the difficulties the United Nations is currently having, which we'll talk about again in the current history lecture. But the problem is, do you really want to set a precedent where ethnic minorities can carve out geographic regions where they happen to be a majority and separate away? Well, this really gets back to this idea of popular sovereignty. And again, we'll deal with it at greater detail shortly hereafter. Okay, and we'll deal with it again in the next lecture as well in current century. But it becomes a very dangerous precedent, because the question becomes, where do you draw the line? Okay? All right. More on that later. As soon as the republics begin to move towards autonomy, This starts with Slovenia and Croatia, which is in the northwestern part of what was Yugoslavia. A problem arises, and this is one of the reasons that the Bush administration backed maintaining the Confederacy, because a number of problems arise. Okay? We'll take, for example, Slovenia. Slovenia moves towards independence. They move towards proclaiming themselves as an independent nation. Okay? The problem is that within the geographic borders of what constitutes Slovenia, there are significant Serbian minorities, all of whom want to stay part of Serbia. The Slovenians, if they break away, will take these people with them. These people don't want to be taken with them. They want to live with Serbia. So what's going to happen is, and this is on both sides, this is not meant to establish responsibility for the first shot fired to either side. But on both sides, what's going to happen is a systematic elimination of ethnic minorities. Okay? The Slovenians in Slovenia will begin to push the Serbs out of their geographic region. Now, we have to understand that the Serbs have lived there for hundreds of years. Okay? Many of them really only moved in after the Second World War, but they've lived there for at least 2 generations. Well, they're being pushed out. Okay? On the other side, the areas of Slovenia that were Serbian majority populations, the geographic regions that were majority Serb, pushed out Slovenians so that they could then make an argument for staying attached to Serbia. Okay? And so this is when we get this very famous idea of ethnic cleansing in the Balkans. This isn't the first incident. The first incident is in what we would refer to as what would be Nagorno-Karabakh. We won't deal with that. That's after the collapse of the Soviet Union. The United States remains uninvolved in that. But in terms of the United States, this is the first time the United States is going to get involved in this ethnic cleansing idea. Okay? The United States it should be perhaps parenthetically added that at the beginning of our class in the late 19th century, the United States foreign policy towards the Native Americans, technically speaking, could be referred to as ethnic cleansing. The forced relocation of populations. And what's going to happen in Slovenia, what's going to happen in Croatia, what's going to happen in Bosnia is concentration camps are going to be established. Okay? They're going to relocate the Serbian population into camps so that they can keep an eye on them, because they're concerned that the Serbian population will join Serbia if Serbia decides to use military force to try to separate out the Serb-dominated areas of Slovenia and Croatia and Bosnia, which in fact is what's going to happen. Okay? And so I want you to get an idea or have an understanding of how amorphous, of how difficult a situation this is. Okay? Of how problematic it is, of how chaotic it can be. You have a geographic region that has multiple ethnic groups. Well, the majority ethnic group decides that they want to break away and form their own republic. The problem is that what happens to those ethnic minorities? Okay? Do we take them with us? Well, if we take them with us, we run the risk that, one, they're being forced to do something that they don't want, and they ultimately will rise up against the majority ethnic group. And so what do we do instead? We push them out of the geographic region. Okay? Or we eliminate them. And so what we're going to see is a series of genocidal massacres that really begin in 91 and will go through to the end of the decade. And they're on both sides. Both sides commit these what are referred to as atrocities, okay, human rights violations. The Serbian reaction is going to be to intervene militarily, to protect. The Serbians intervene militarily to protect the Serbian populations in these areas that are proclaiming independence. Okay, so in other words, they intervene militarily in Slovenia and Croatia to protect the Serbian minorities in Slovenia and Croatia. Okay, they then begin to move in the direction of pushing out any Slovenians and Croatians away from the Serbian populations so that they can then absorb those geographic regions that are dominated by the Serbians back into Serbia. And this is what's going to create the overall conflict. Okay? And it's going to happen in all of them. It's going to happen in Slovenia. It's going to happen in Croatia. It's going to happen in Bosnia. It's going to happen in Kosovo. It's going to happen in Macedonia. It happens anytime you have this multi-ethnic problem. Okay? And the problem ultimately gets to the idea. The ultimate problem is, how do you establish this? How is it done that an ethnic minority, okay, that doesn't want to be part of a multi-ethnic group, a multi-ethnic culture, okay, can carve itself out a piece of territory to call its own? This is a difficult undertaking, okay? The way that we're going to do it, the way that they're going to try it in the Balkans, is by pushing out any minority populations, okay? So the Slovenians, Croatians, Bosnians will push out the Serbian populations from areas dominated by Bosnians and Croats and Slovenians. The Serbian populations within Slovenia will try to push out the Slovenians from the smaller geographic areas that they're dominant. Okay? And so it becomes a very confused situation. And as I said, atrocities are committed on both sides. You have large series of militias that are operating. We don't have we have organized military bodies, and we have disorganized military bodies. We have paramilitary groups and military groups all operating in the same environment. The United Nations is going to try to step into this and try to make some sort of order out of this. And it's a very difficult undertaking, okay, for the United Nations. It's going to be the first time that the United Nations is really tested in doing something like this. And as I said, it's a very difficult problem for them to deal with. And so what they're going to do is they're going to begin to pass a series of Security Council resolutions that sanction the Serbian use of force. Now, there's a lot of reasons why they specifically sanction Serbia. Okay? A lot of it is because it's very difficult for the United Nations. Serbia represents the only state-oriented military force at this point. Slovenia really is a neonate republic. It really hasn't developed as a state. Okay? So you can't sanction something that's not a member state. Now, they ultimately will. They'll pass sanctions against any of the paramilitary organizations operating in the Balkans. But at first, they begin to sanction against the Serbs. And they'll set up an international criminal tribunal. This is before the creation. In fact, the International Criminal Court will be created as a direct result of what happens in the Balkans to deal with future situations like this. But they'll organize an international tribunal on a kind of an ad hoc basis, a temporary body, to prosecute anyone they can bring to trial for human rights violations, particularly these mass atrocities that are being committed. They immediately target the Serbian commanders. They will ultimately target others as well, but the Serbs will always take the brunt of international pressure over this. Okay? They will then go in and proclaim in Bosnia, when the Bosnian crisis really begins to explode, they will create what are referred to as safe areas in Bosnia, the most famous of which is the Bosnian capital of Sarajevo. Okay, in which the idea of a safe area is that it is a non-militarized zone. No fighting can take place. The basic idea behind it is it creates a safe area for refugees to run to. In other words, when you have all these paramilitary groups and military groups battling it out, okay, for geographic territory, that's going to create enormous amounts of civilian refugee problems. Civilians are going to get caught in the crossfire. Well, by creating these safe areas, the civilians will have some place to run to where they won't get shot at. Now, the Serbians claim, with some evidence to support them, that, and in point of fact, both sides begin to use this. The problem with a safe area like that is that particularly paramilitary organizations can use them as a rally point. Okay? In other words, we can gather strength and stay out of harm's way by going into a safe area. We go into a safe area, okay, and then collect arms in that safe area, and then move out of the safe area to battle our opponents. And this is what the Serbs begin to argue is taking place. And in point of fact, they have evidence to support that. At one point, I can remember this, because this is now recent history. I like being back on recent history. And I can remember this because at one point, a news account comes out that in the city of Sarajevo, the Serbs will besiege the city, okay? Because they become convinced that what's happening is the Bosnian paramilitary groups are using Sarajevo as a rally point to gather arms and crystallize men, okay, military force, and then mobilize them. So the Serbs surround Sarajevo and begin shelling the city, begin to launch artillery into the city. But they surround the area, and at one point, they intercept a UN convoy, which is absolutely stocked full of military hardware en route to the Bosnian Muslim paramilitaries. Okay, and it really gets to something that I can remember making this argument. I can remember this was when I was in graduate school, and I can remember the arguments we would get into in graduate school about this. Okay, the situation literally went on month after month after month, and I said, you know, one of two things has to be true here. We're being presented by the United States, okay, during the 1990s. Now, the Clinton administration is moving in the direction of direct military intervention into this crisis. Okay, and so the Clinton administration is trying to rally public support in the United States. And so what we're seeing on the TV in the United States in the early 90s are the poor Bosnian Muslim civilians being slaughtered by these horrendous Serbian military forces. Okay, one of two things has to be true, because this goes on for 9 months. Okay, it ultimately goes on for better than a year and a half. Okay, one of two things has to be true. Either one, the Serbian military is the most incompetent military ever to have existed, because they are fighting an unarmed civilian population and don't seem to be able to win. Okay? Or two, what we're being presented with, which is that the Bosnian Muslim population are all civilians and unarmed, just isn't true. That in fact they are armed and are capable of offering resistance to the Serbian military. The latter of these, ultimately, in the light of evidence, will prove to be the case. Okay, the interception of the UN convoy, which I can remember very vividly, demonstrates this. That in point of fact, both the United States and, at this point, NATO, this is the redefinition of NATO, and the European Union and the United Nations will be funneling arms to the Bosnian Muslims. Okay, they'll do the same thing in Kosovo, they did the same thing in Slovenia, and they did the same thing in Croatia. Okay, that's why the Serbian military wasn't able to win. It wasn't because they were incompetent, it's because the forces they were being set against, which were presented as unarmed civilians, were in fact not unarmed civilians. Okay? And so the situation in Sarajevo will spin out of control completely. And a series of UN sanctions and ultimately war crimes tribunals will be brought against the Serbian military for doing it, etc. Okay, but this is the basic idea behind it. Into all of this, the Clinton administration decides, and there's a problem to it, but from a certain perspective, it makes sense. As I mentioned earlier, the Clinton administration is running the danger that the NATO organization and the United States, as the leading member of NATO, is going to be marginalized. There needs to be a redefinition of the role. The Balkans crisis gives an excellent opportunity to do that. It's in Europe. It could be argued, and will be argued by the Clinton administration, that stabilizing the Balkans is critical to European security in general. Okay, and that's the argument that the Clinton administration is going to make to NATO and to the European Union, and ultimately to the United Nations. Okay, and so in terms of that, it makes sense for the Clinton administration to move in the direction of intervention. The problem is, you are involving yourself in a situation that really has no definition in a military sense. You're dealing with, to use the term which is too frequently used, overused, you're dealing with another Vietnam. You're dealing with a quasi-insurgency mixed with military force. Okay? So you're dealing with a situation that is going to be, at the very least, difficult to control. And so, as 1993 and as the situation develops and as it degenerates, the United States is going to go to the United Nations and to the NATO High Command, advocating intervention in this conflict. And the conditions for the intervention, the engagement rules, are all going to be unprecedented. Okay, you're going to be dealing with very difficult rules of engagement. Ultimately, and unfortunately, the Clinton administration is going to simplify these engagement rules and use the U.S. military and NATO, okay, and the multinational force, to attack the only hard targets available, which are all Serbian military forces. And so the Serbs are going to take it on the nose. Ultimately, as it begins, and it really began this way. Okay, the United Nations, NATO, the United States, the European Union, all of them will move in the direction of opposition to Serbia. Okay, and so it's the Serbian military that's going to be targeted. It's the Serbian military that's portrayed as committing all of these acts of atrocity and genocide, and it's not to say that they didn't. Okay, historical evidence is such that it suggests that there is ample evidence that some of the military commanders and some of the Serbian military did in fact engage in this. But so were the other sides. All sides to the conflict engaged in these atrocities. NATO, the European Union, the United States, and the UN will target only the Serbs because effectively the Serbs are the only target. Okay, the other groups are all paramilitary organizations. They integrate and then disintegrate on a weekly basis. They come and go. They're very mobile. They're like water. Okay, the Serbians are an actual hard target military, and so they're going to take the brunt of the attack. And in the light of history, be assigned the majority of the blame. Okay, in conclusion of the United States' involvement in the Balkans crisis, it's going to conclude with Kosovo, and it's going to be a very similar situation to what we had in Bosnia and Slovenia and Croatia, with the same kind of ethnic purging, the UN sanctioning of the use of force. And as I've said before, what the entire crisis is going to do is fundamentally redefine the role of NATO. NATO will no longer be specifically designated to contain the influence of the Soviet Union or to prevent incursions by the Soviet Union. It will now be used to promote European security and European interests, and it will in fact be NATO that becomes involved in Afghanistan in 2001, as distantly removed as that might be from European security. But at any rate, that will completely redefine the role of NATO. And after the Balkans crisis, they proposed this International War Crimes Tribunal, which they had initiated. They proposed making it a permanent body. It would be loosely organized along the lines of the International Court of Justice. It would be the International Criminal Court that would specifically try cases of human rights violations. Particularly genocide, but not only genocide. And the United States actually originally proposes it, but then falls back on it and doesn't support it. Okay, and only recently really gives it any attention whatsoever. And the reason for that is it's really kind of funny because the United States proposes this because at the time they propose it, it's beyond their wildest imagination that they or Israel will ever be brought up on charges. But as they begin to discuss this, they start to realize that it would be possible, at least in a hypothetical sense, if you establish this court, that agents and agencies of the United States could be brought up on charges, and agents and agencies of Israel could be brought up on charges. And so the United States withdraws its support for the ICC. And as it works out, one of the things we'll talk about in current history in the next lecture is the idea that the United States currently has 47 bilateral agreements with countries that, in order to get U.S. assistance, Afghanistan and Iraq are two of them, okay? In order to get assistance, they will not bring charges at the ICC either against any member of the United States or any members of the State of Israel. And those are bilateral agreements. You can actually Google them and look them up online. But at any rate, okay. Now, on to Middle East policy. The Clinton administration is going to commit itself to outlining a more permanent peace between Israel and the Palestinians. At least rhetorically, that's what it's going to do. Now, I mentioned the difficulties that Bush 41 had in his relationship with the State of Israel. Okay, and the fact that when he threatens to suspend the guarantee of those loans, the American Israeli Public Affairs Committee takes an anti-Bush attitude, which they did not originally have, because they saw him as the holdover to the Reagan administration. And when they do so, he loses a lot of his public support and will ultimately lose the election. The Clinton administration will not make the same mistake. Okay, so the Clinton administration comes in with the support of the pro-Israeli lobby in the United States. This is going to ultimately be somewhat problematic for the Clinton administration. We'll deal with that when we deal with war with the fundamentalists in just a minute here. But the Clinton administration is going to move in and organize what are known as the Oslo Accords. And the Oslo Accords is currently the roadmap to peace that you might have heard of. If you pay attention to the news, you hear this roadmap to peace, this two-state solution. These flow from the Oslo Accords. The Oslo Accords will be negotiated in the 1990s. Okay? Now, and we see what the conditions are here in Oslo 1. Oslo 1 is really just a preliminary agreement. Okay? It's more or less an agreement to enter into a negotiating process. Okay? The substantive thing that's going to come out of it is Israel will recognize the Palestine Liberation Organization as the representative of the newly established Palestine Authority, which will be established in Oslo 1. Okay? So this will grant the Palestinian Liberation Organization some legitimacy. In exchange for this, the PLO will recognize the sovereignty of the State of Israel and will forswear any violence against the State of Israel and enter into negotiations, okay, seek a diplomatic solution. Now, the problem with this, and one of the reasons that the Clinton administration does this, and one of the reasons that the Israelis endorse this is going to split the Palestinian movement. It's going to move in the direction, ultimately, of what will take place, a civil war within the Palestinian movement. Because especially after 83, the Palestine Liberation Organization splits along two general categories. You have Al-Fatah, which is currently headed by Mahmoud Abbas, and the Palestine Authority. Those are the guys that are currently engaged in any peace negotiations with Israel. Okay, that's the one group. The other group are the more radical elements of the Palestine Liberation Organization that do not accept Israel and will not accept any negotiated peace treaty. Okay, if we take for an example the group Hamas, Hamas has repeatedly stated, okay, Mashal, who is the head of Hamas currently, just last week restated it, that they are committed to the destruction of the State of Israel, who they see as an occupying force in Palestine. Okay, so these will splinter completely. Al-Fatah receives absolutely no support whatsoever from the more radical elements of the group, and Al-Fatah does not support any of the radical elements. So because Al-Fatah is the only organization involved in this peace process, the peace process itself is really kind of moot. Because even if Al-Fatah agreed to it, it would be impossible to implement because the remaining elements of the Palestine Liberation Organization, the Palestinian movement, don't accept Al-Fatah, okay? Which is why it becomes great political theater, but really it's more semblance than substance, okay? And it will be immediately rejected. Oslo 1 and Oslo 2, for that matter, will be immediately rejected by both the hardliners. See, it's difficult not to get into these amplifications and background amplifications, but I try to avoid them as best I can, but not to get involved in Israeli politics. The two main groups in Israel in politics are the Likud Party and the Labor Party. The Labor Party generally supports the idea of exchanging land for peace and recognition of Israel's sovereignty. The Likud Party fundamentally rejects the idea of trading land for peace. They do not seek any kind of diplomatic solution. This is the government of Benjamin Netanyahu. Okay? They feel that the PLO is a terrorist organization and they won't deal with it. And so there is this division within Israel. Okay? And in point of fact, it will lead to Ehud Barak will be a labor government, a labor prime minister. It will lead to his assassination, okay, from a member of the hard line of Israel. At this time, after Oslo I, kind of parenthetically, I would add that the organization that I've mentioned a few times, AIPAC, the American Israeli Public Affairs Committee, which was committed to maintaining U.S. support for the state of Israel, changes its tack. Okay, it changes its objective. It no longer, and this is up to date, ever since Oslo. AIPAC no longer advocates simply support for the state of Israel. It now advocates only support for the Likud Party. It's one of the reasons that Netanyahu won the election recently, about a month ago. Okay, is that AIPAC threw all kinds of money his way. But at any rate, all right, so it's rejected by the Likud Party, which is the hardline party, and most of the Orthodox parties in Israel, and by the radical elements of the Palestinians. And so it's really a dead peace treaty before it really even comes. They then move in to further negotiations of the Taba Agreement, which is known as Oslo II, in 95. And this is where they get a little bit more specific in terms of the provisions. And this is currently the basic framework that they've been trying to work with for 20 years. To no avail. There's been virtually no progress whatsoever on this, because neither of the hardline elements, either of Israel or of the Palestinians, accept the idea that this is working on. The idea is basically a two-state solution. Okay, we talked at some length in the lecture on the post-World War II about the UN Security Council and their intervention in this crisis and their division of the area of Palestine into two states, one a Jewish homeland known as Israel, the other a Palestinian state. Well, now we're working with that idea again, okay? So we work on this two-state solution. We work on provisions where the Palestinians agree to forego any violence against the state of Israel and to recognize Israeli sovereignty. On Israel's part, they'll agree to no new settlements in the West Bank, and we'll deal with how this goes on. We'll deal with these negotiations and how it's developed when we get to the last lecture on current history, because in point of fact, the Likud government under Netanyahu is now the longest reigning government in Israeli history. It's dominated for the last 12 years, and they have continued to build new settlements on the West Bank in violation of Oslo, which are not recognized by international law. Okay, it's also the Netanyahu government that has besieged the Gaza Strip and has occupied the Gaza Strip and now blockades the Gaza Strip. Okay, so the Oslo II calls for the withdrawal of Israel from the Gaza Strip, which kind of takes place. Okay, it also calls for ultimately elections within the Palestinian Authority. Now, the reason for including that, and it's something that we'll get to, we get it at American Foreign Policy quite a bit, is a self-deception on the part of the United States, which is ultimately going to come back to haunt them. Okay, the United States has operated from the late 60s, okay, on the premise, and it does it everywhere. It does it we see it in Afghanistan, we see it in Cuba, we see it everywhere. Okay, the United States believes that the groups that are opposed to the U.S., okay, that in this case, the hardline position, the hardline elements in the Palestinian movement that reject outright any negotiations with Israel are a tiny minority. Okay, and so if we hold popular elections, al-Fatah will win. This tiny minority of radicals will be isolated, and we'll be able to move forward. That will validate everything that's been done. Okay? Well, in point of fact, just kind of to jump to the chase, the Palestinians do in fact hold elections. They hold elections in 2006. The elections have international observation teams there, among them from the UN, from Amnesty International, from Human Rights Watch, all of whom proclaim that the elections are free and fair. Okay? And Hamas wins over 70% of the vote. The United States didn't see this coming. Okay? So this is a very problematic thing for the U.S. and for Israel. Now, Israel will maintain control over the borders of the Palestine Authority in Gaza and the West Bank, financing, trade, the monetary system. Okay? And in fact, in point of fact, just recently, and you know what, I'm going to reserve that for the discussion of recent history. Yeah, I'm going to stop myself there. Stop me before I go on anymore, and I'm going to restrict that to the discussion of current history in the next lecture. Spilling over into this is war with the radical fundamentalists. Okay? Now we look at U.S. involvement in the peace process and the difficulties that are involved in that. We look at U.S. increasing influence in the Gulf region. Okay? We look at U.S. involvement in the original Yemeni civil war in the early 90s, and the United States is now perched to get involved in the most recent Yemeni civil war. Okay? Well, the problem on the first point is that the U.S. involvement in the peace process, nobody in the region, okay, deceives themselves into believing that the United States has adopted any kind of a neutral position. It is well known, okay, if we just look at UN Security Council resolution votes alone, it's well known that the United States is the supporter of the State of Israel. Well, how can the United States enter into this peace process as a neutral arbiter to mediate the process? Okay? So neither the radical elements of the Palestinians or the Islamic fundamentalists or really anyone recognizes the United States as a legitimate mediator in the peace process, and therefore the peace process itself is fundamentally corrupted because of this. Okay? Secondly, we see the U.S. influence in the Gulf region, particularly since Operation Desert Storm. Okay? During Operation Desert Storm, this was the first time that Saudi Arabia allowed non-Muslims into the holy city of Mecca. And it was because the United States insisted on it. There were so many U.S. forces there that they needed to be able to maintain control. Okay? This is, and so the cut on this from the radical fundamentalists is that the ever-increasing amount of influence the United States exerts in the Gulf region further corrupts Islam itself from outside influences. Okay? And so the more the United States involves itself, the more it fuels the fire of the radical element of the fundamentalist movement that calls for a return to the original principles of Islam and claims that Islam has been corrupted by outside influence. This will ultimately lead to the bombing of the coal during the Yemeni civil war, which will lead to the only really unilateral response by the Clinton administration. It will be the first U.S. attack on the Taliban regime in Afghanistan. It will be airstrikes and against Sudan. Okay? Now, post-Desert Storm, and this is the Clinton administration is going to deal with this, they play a game throughout the 90s of U.S. brinksmanship. Okay? The UN sanctions are in place. The Clinton administration continually argues that Iraq is violating the sanctions, which to some degree they are, particularly one of the sanctions I hadn't mentioned earlier when I first introduced them, was that Iraq was severely limited in terms of its sale of its number one resource, petroleum. Okay, so the Clinton administration will advocate with the UN that Iraq is in violation of this. The United States will then back, okay? They don't really create the organization, but they fund and militarily support a group known as the Iraqi National Accord, which will ultimately become the Iraqi National Congress, okay? Which will be kind of spearhead the efforts to democratize Iraq or to transition Iraq after the Ba'ath regime is overthrown in 2003. They're an insurgent group that will operate against the Ba'athist government in Baghdad. through a series of sabotage and bombing campaigns. They'll also plant sensors for the United States that will home in smart weapons from the United States for the prospective attacks that the United States will launch. And the United States will use these as it launches airstrikes through the 90s. What's going to happen is a series of brinksmanship. The U.S. will claim that Iraq is violating the sanctions, will go to the United Nations. It's important to note that the United Nations never actually sanctions the use of force. Then the United States will launch airstrikes against Iraq to knock out some of the things, to enforce the no-fly zone, etc., etc., etc. And so it will constantly ratchet up the tension. There will constantly be this tension throughout. And finally, Congress will pass in October of 1998 the Iraq Liberation Act, which makes it U.S. policy, an objective of U.S. policy, to overthrow the Hussein government in Iraq and the Ba'athist regime. Okay? So that what we see by this, especially this Iraq Liberation Act, is that Bush 43, when he comes in, and we'll deal with this in current history, Bush 43, when he comes in, he tries to make the argument that Iraq was in violation of sanctions against the development of weapons of mass destruction and was somehow linked to Al-Qaeda. And that's why the United States was going to invade Iraq. Well, in point of fact, that's not entirely true. Okay, the United States started targeting Iraq right after the Iraq-Iran War. It becomes official U.S. policy in 98. And so from that point forward, the United States looks for any excuse to pull the trigger. The United States supports an insurgency against the Ba'athist government, really from the early 90s onwards. And so all that 9/11 in the United States does is give the United States an excuse. In point of fact, they never did establish any connection between Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda. And in fact, Saddam Hussein was not well liked by Al-Qaeda because he was a secular government. But okay, so that's gonna lead us up to ultimately Operation, what they call Iraqi Freedom, which is in current history. As a conclusion to Clinton's foreign policy, some of the things that I've been saying. Okay, first we have a changing nature of the United Nations. The Clinton administration will be the first to seek UN sanctioning for all U.S. actions. It's not that the United States hasn't gotten sanctioning for U.S. actions before, but previous presidencies were more willing to use unilateral force. Okay, ultimately the Clinton administration will use unilateral force because he'll go to the United Nations after the bombing of the Cole. He'll go to the United Nations to try to get sanctioning for the use of force against Afghanistan and Sudan with these airstrikes. But the UN feels there's insufficient evidence to tie these two member states to the bombing of the USS Cole. And it really is more for international relations. I'll just touch on it here. But the United Nations, it brings up with the United Nations in the 1990s a problem with which the UN is still dealing, and we'll deal with it more in current history as we deal with the Bush 43 administration and the Obama administration. There are two problems that exist as you see what I refer to them as is soft law. They are not in international law. They are not in the United Nations Charter, but they're gradually moving in the direction of solidifying as legal arrangements. And the United States, the United Nations, really hasn't very clearly drawn any kind of line of demarcation or done anything to really clarify either of these 2 points. Okay? And again, we'll deal with them more when we deal with current history, but the first of them is what's called R2P, the right to protect. Okay? Under the UN Charter, the sovereignty of member states is inviolable. What they do within their territories is their business. The R2P says that, and again, it's a soft law. It's an international norm. Okay? And it really comes up in the 90s during the Balkans crisis that if a member state cannot or will not protect its citizens, then it becomes the responsibility of the international community and the United Nations to so do. Okay? The United States will use this as the premise of intervention in Libya in 2011, as the potential for intervention in Syria, as the current intervention in Syria with airstrikes, etc. Okay, if a government isn't willing to protect its own citizens, or cannot protect its own citizens, okay, or preys on its own citizens, then it's the responsibility of the international community to go in there and protect the civilian population. Okay, this comes directly out of the Balkans crisis, and this becomes problematic for reasons that we'll get into later, and we get into it at some length in international relations. The problem is, how do you establish this? What serves as the international norm? Okay, what serves as demonstration that a state is unable to protect its own citizens? Okay, so for example, let's just take as an example, okay, the Columbine shootings in Colorado in the 1990s, or Newtown in Connecticut. Okay, does that establish the government's inability to protect its citizen when some guy goes in with a machine gun or with a rifle? That movie theater out in Colorado just recently, when somebody goes on a shooting spree like that, does that establish the government's inability to protect its civilian population? Does that then open it up for the international community to come in and do it? There's the problem. Okay, how do you define this? And even more problematic is this idea of popular sovereignty. Okay, the Balkans brings it up. It was brought up before, okay? It's existed since the United Nations, but it never really was stressed. Now it's being stressed as a point, okay? The idea of popular sovereignty is that the people that exist in a given geographic region should have self-determination of their own government. Okay, fine. How do you define a geographic region, and how do you define a group of people? Okay, we saw this problem recently with the Crimea. Well, the fact is, about 80% of the people in Crimea speak Russian. They are ethnically Russians. As part of the deal when the Soviet Union broke up, they were attached to the Ukraine. They didn't want to be part of the Ukraine. They were attached. And so recently, when the crisis began, the Crimeans voted to join Russia. Okay? Well, this is a problem. Okay? What happens? Here's the problem. What happens if for example, if the Hispanic population, if the Latino population of Miami, of South Florida, okay, now as it works out, Latinos in South Florida are about 50% of the population, a little bit better. What if they vote to break away from the United States and form their own republic, the Republic of South Florida? Where's popular sovereignty then? Okay, so this is a problem with which the United Nations is still dealing, and we'll deal with it a little bit more in current history. But that concludes Clinton's foreign policy, and we're now going to move on, I think, to domestic policy. All right, now let's start with the position of the Bush administration. Okay, Bush comes in 1989, runs in the 88 election. Reagan by 88 was very popular. He was one of the most popular. He had one of the highest popularity ratings in U.S. history because for reasons that we talked about in the lecture on the 1980s, the American economy was on the upswing again. Now Bush comes in, but the Reagan administration is prohibited, because of the 22nd Amendment, is prohibited from standing for the presidency again because he's already served 2 terms. So his vice president gets the sanctioning of the Republican Party and of Ronald Reagan himself, and so we'll win the election in 88. And one of the things that he promises is that he says, and I can remember him saying it, he says, "Read my lips, no new taxes." Okay, but he's got a problem. He comes in, and Reagan's deficit, okay, in 1988 is 26.7% of the gross domestic product. Okay, Reagan's spending in general was 31.3% of the GDP. That's the largest non-wartime spending level as a percentage of GDP in U.S. history. Okay, so with this kind of deficit, Bush comes in a political climate and advocating reducing the government deficit. Okay? Well, how the hell is he going to do that? Okay? Is he going to cut spending? Well, if he cuts spending, he's going to have to cut all these programs, and if you cut spending, it risks triggering the economy back into a recession. We've dealt at some length over the last few lectures with the idea of Keynesian economics. Okay, to cut spending, which is within the Keynesian model. Okay, it makes sense. It will reduce government spending, will reduce the deficit. but it also will reduce government spending, which will reduce aggregate demand and could trigger a recession. So that's hardly an option. Okay? Well, you can't keep spending, you can't keep tax levels at the same without continuing this series of deficits that really began with Johnson. Okay? This isn't Bush's fault, this isn't Reagan's fault. They really begin with Johnson and move on from there. Okay? And each president we've seen is they've tried to do something to correct this. Not so much Carter. He really didn't do very much of anything. But it's an ongoing problem, and we'll deal with it more when we deal with current history as well. Okay? So he's faced with this problem. And then we have the S&L crisis. This is a forerunner of the 2008 banking crisis, where you have these savings and loan institutions investing in very, very speculative investments and going belly up. This is the first time that we see this idea of too big to fail. It'll be the first time that we see the government becoming involved in bailing out the financial sector, okay, which hadn't happened before this. It will ultimately cost the government $525 billion. Well, this is going to exacerbate government spending. You know, George, baby, how are you going to bring spending down when you're shelling out $525 billion to bail out these S&Ls? Well, we can't not bail out the S&Ls, George says. We can't not bail out the S&Ls because if we don't bail them out, where are we going to get any kind of bank liquidity? There's going to be no liquidity left to invest, and the economy is going to trigger into a recession. Okay? In 1990, okay, midway through Bush will take over in January of 89, Congress is going to pass a deficit reduction law that's going to force the Bush administration to reduce the deficit. Well, okay, you know, here's Bush. How am I going to do this? You know, I have to bail out the S&Ls. I have to maintain government spending to keep aggregate demand up, to keep the economy from triggering into a recession. Okay, but now I have to reduce the deficit by law. Well, how am I going to do this? The only possible way of doing this is to increase taxes. And so Bush will come out in 1990 and increase taxes, okay, which is a wildly unpopular thing to do. It is, I would parenthetically add, within the Keynesian model to do this. Once the economy gets better, once it's repaired itself, once it starts to grow, what does Keynes say? We've looked at it before. You cut government spending, you increase taxes, that increases government revenue, it creates a government surplus. With that surplus, you pay down your deficit that you've accumulated. We know this now, okay? We've covered this so many times, right? So Bush is going to increase taxes, a wildly unpopular thing to do. Not just because it's a tax increase. A tax increase the American people can deal with. Okay? They're going to deal with it with the Clinton administration. They can grimace and bite it. Okay? They can take it. But the Bush administration specifically said in its campaign promises that it would not increase taxes. This makes Bush look like a liar. Between that and his alienation of AIPAC for his policy on Israel, Bush is dead in the water, okay, by the time the 92 election rolls along. Okay. On to the domestic situation with the Clinton administration in the 90s. Clinton really is going to win the election because Clinton moves forward from a centrist position. It was actually kind of interesting that what we saw with Clinton was the crystallization, a movement towards a more central party, not the very, social spending government intervention of the extreme of the Democratic Party, nor of the extreme of the Republican Party, the laissez-faire. More of a central position is what's going to be the base of support for Clinton. He's going to introduce something that becomes known as Clintonomics. Okay, and we see what it is there. Stimulation of the economy to create jobs. Clinton will create 22 million jobs during his time as president. Okay, growth of the economic sector, and what we mean by that is not just the economic sector, but the export sector of the economy, through the expansion of free trade and the support for the general agreement on tariffs and trade. Okay? In addition to this, Clinton's going to go in with the idea of, well, we can trim off government spending not by massive cuts to spending, but just by reform of some things. And principally, he takes on two things. He takes on welfare reform and healthcare reform. And the healthcare reform will not work. Okay, it will not pass. And what Clinton's going to initiate is an era that he refers to as new federalism. One of the ways we're going to cut government spending from the national government is to delegate a lot of the responsibilities back to the states. Okay, to cut government spending. This is the basic philosophy behind Clinton's economics. He will coordinate through his entire time, okay? And Alan Greenspan has said, Alan Greenspan spans a number of presidents, okay? He comes in at the very end of Reagan, he spans Bush, he spans Clinton, and then the second Bush, Bush 43. And he says that of all of them, his favorite to work with was Clinton, because he said Clinton was the brightest and understood economics the most. Okay, so he will coordinate. Greenspan, the head of the Federal Reserve, and Clinton will coordinate in an economic policy at really an unprecedented level. We saw with the Reagan administration that Paul Volcker, who was the head of the Federal Reserve, didn't really coordinate with Reagan. He didn't really see the economy at the same, through the same prism as did Reagan. And so while Reagan was trying this loose policy to stimulate the economy, Volcker was worried about bringing inflation down, and so had a tighter monetary policy. Greenspan and Clinton are going to see things eye to eye. And so both of them are going to advocate a loose monetary policy where money is available, where credit is available, where bank liquidity is constantly going up. All right. Now the effect of this is to initiate an unprecedented level of economic growth. Okay. That growth is going to largely be fueled by private debt. And it's one of those things that those of us who study economics have wondered about this. Okay? How is it possible for the Clinton administration to have initiated an unrelented period of growth, average growth rate of 4% per year for the entirety of the time that he was in office? Okay? And maintain a low inflation rate and a low unemployment rate, and at the end of it, come up with a government surplus. Okay? We've seen presidents do it before. We've seen presidents stimulate growth by increasing government spending and cutting taxes. They end up with a deficit. It stimulates the economy somewhat. They get some growth. Okay, fine. We've seen that. What we've never seen before is what Clinton is able to do. How does he do this? And we scratch our heads and wonder about that. Well, finally, in 2008, and something again that we'll deal with in the current history lecture, is, we now begin to see how he did this. Okay? Private debt in the 1990s in the United States will mushroom. Okay? What we'll see, for example, if we look at just a couple of these figures, and I got these from the Bureau of Economic Analysis, under the Reagan and Bush administration, as a percentage of disposable income on an annual basis, the average savings of Americans was 8.95% of disposable income. Okay? Which is, if we look at it through multipliers and more hardcore macroeconomics, that means a marginal propensity to consume of about 91.5%. 91.05%, I should say. Under the Clinton administration, that savings is going to drop to 5.25%. Now, that's aggregate. Okay? Private sector debt, okay, the debt of the private sector, this is individual households and corporations, but mostly individual households. The private sector debt is going to go from 48% of the GDP in 1991, okay, 1992 rather, to over 75% of the GDP in 2000. Okay, so private sector debt is going to mushroom, and the best description of it that I ever heard was from the political pundit George Will, and he said it very concisely. He said, during the Clinton administration, during the 1990s, what took place was the American people treated themselves to a spending spree that they couldn't afford. How did they do this? They went into hawk. They borrowed money. Everyone in the 90s went deeper and deeper. The government didn't. Clinton actually cut government spending as a percentage of the GDP, and he actually didn't raise taxes that much. He ends up with a government surplus. No, this is the first time we're going to see this. We didn't see this before. We saw other presidents do this. From Franklin Roosevelt on, we saw the government use government spending and tax cuts to stimulate the economy. This is old hat to us. This is Keynesian economics. Clinton is going to try a completely different approach, and Greenspan is going to go right with it. Okay? A loose monetary policy make credit really easy. Everybody borrows money. The private sector borrows money. Okay? They go deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper into debt. All right? That's how Clinton's going to do this. That's how we're going to have growth. That's how we're going to keep inflation down. That's how we're going to maintain low levels of unemployment. This is the Clinton miracle. Okay? Now, the problem is that that puts everybody in debt. To continue that indefinitely is a difficult thing, because eventually the piper has to be paid. Well, 2008 comes along and the piper needs to be paid, and nobody can pay the piper. Okay? Clinton's 8 years out of office. What the hell does he care? This is the problem with an open political system. Okay? The weird thing is that Clinton may or may not have seen this coming. He was a bright fellow. He's probably, in my lifetime, he's by far the most intelligent of the presidents. He may have seen this coming. Okay? The bizarre thing, Greenspan didn't see this coming. Okay? Greenspan didn't see this. It took him by surprise. He had left the Federal Reserve as chair by the time 2008 crisis comes along, but he didn't see it coming. Okay? And it basically gets down to Greenspan's philosophy. And I always question whether or not Clinton understood this and exploited it and manipulated Greenspan. I'd like to think that, because Greenspan was always one of my heroes, you know. But Greenspan's philosophical position economically is that an economy need not ever experience a recession. That you can, through stimulation, through a loose monetary policy, through a very carefully controlled monetary policy, prevent a recession from ever happening. We've seen this. We've seen the national government, the federal government, through fiscal policy, attempt the same thing, using Keynesian economics to prevent a recession. Well, with Greenspan, he's using monetarism. Okay, he's using monetary policy to prevent a recession. And the idea is, can you actually do this? Can you prevent a recession indefinitely? Okay? Greenspan thought you could. Don't know whether or not Clinton actually thought you could. Okay? Maybe he did. The policies he invokes certainly suggest that he did. Okay? And so that's how they're going to do it. Not by public debt, but by increasing private debt. In terms of fiscal growth, the Clinton administration is going to commit itself to two things: economic growth and deficit reduction. Under Clinton, the average growth rate, as I've said, is 4%. He'll create 22 million jobs. The inflation rate will be below 5%. The unemployment rate will be moderate at below 7%. At this time, the natural rate of unemployment, which is when you're using absolutely the maximum productive capacity, is about 5.5%. Okay, so you really have manageable levels of unemployment, manageable levels of inflation. The average level under Clinton, you see, is 2.3%. In 99, Clinton is going to restructure the financial sector itself. In many ways, he's going to do this because by this point, he sees what's going on. And I'm sure Greenspan saw it by this point in terms of private debt. By this point, private debt has really gone through the roof. We need another source of funding the private sector. And so he'll initiate the Financial Services Modernization Act. What this is going to do is repeal Glass-Steagall. We talked about the Glass-Steagall Act. What the Glass-Steagall Act does is separate commercial banking from investment banking so that commercial banks can't make investments. Okay, and they did this. This was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Okay, they did this so that the liquidity of the commercial banks, where people put their deposits and have their money, won't be threatened by these commercial banks engaging in risky investments. Okay, the Clinton administration will repeal this as another part of that Financial Services Modernization Act. It will allow a mushrooming of interstate banking. Okay, banks used to have to get licenses to operate in any state, and so there were literally banks that would operate only in one state. The Fifth Third Bank was like that. The Huntington Bank was like that. Well, after this, they're able to open branches in multiple states. Okay, and so it's going to usher in the era of liberal borrowing and of commercial banks making investments. This is ultimately going to be one of the precipitory causes of the crisis of 2008, is all of this investment in some very risky investments by the commercial banking sector. He will also pass, during his administration, the Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act. Okay? This isn't going to be really an outright tax increase. It is and it isn't. Okay? It is and it isn't. Okay? This is how he's going to end up with a surplus. Or at least one of the ways. We're going to raise the high. You see what the Omnibus Budget does, the Reconciliation Act does. It raises the highest tax bracket. From the Reagan administration topped it out at 30%. We're going to raise it up to 36 to 39%. Corporate taxes will be raised to 35%. We will repeal the cap on Medicare. Under the Medicare Act, the amount of money, okay, that someone has to pay into for their Medicare has a cap on it. Okay, there's a maximum limit. We're going to get rid of that. Medicare is now going to become a pay-in system. That's the way Medicare is now. Medicare is government health insurance. Okay, my wife, who is on a Social Security disability, she has to pay $105 a month for Medicare. My mother's in the same boat. She's on Social Security. She has to pay into Medicare. Okay? The Clinton administration under the Reconciliation Act will also increase the tax rate on Social Security income. Social Security income was never taxed very high. The Clinton administration is going to increase that tax rate. My wife was kind of surprised. We just looked over our taxes. Our accountant sent them to us, and we looked over our taxes. And she was a little surprised that she had to pay any taxes on the Social Security distributions she's been getting on her disability. And I explained to her that it was really the Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act. They'd done it before, but Social Security is taxable. It's taxable income. It's taxed at the lowest tax rate, but it's still taxable income. Now, overall, this is going to increase tax revenues, which means more money coming into the government. At the same time, the welfare reform that the Clinton administration, which we're about to get into, is going to lower spending levels. That's how Clinton will end up with his surplus. That's what brings us to government spending. Okay? The Welfare Reform Act is going to be the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Act. What's going to happen under this is welfare reform to cut spending is my way of truncating it and simplifying it. Basically, you're going to replace welfare with workfare. What we're going to do is we're going to limit the amount of time that someone gets welfare. We're going to initiate, under the welfare program, a series of jobs trainings. Okay, I remember when I was in graduate school, the woman that lived above me, Denise was her name. She's a nice enough woman. She was a recipient of welfare. She was a single mother with 2 kids. She was getting welfare, and she took advantage of this act, the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Act. She used welfare to fund education for herself. She went to school as a cosmetologist, ultimately got a job, and got off the welfare rolls. That was the idea behind the bill. Okay? Now, healthcare reform, and that's going to cut government spending. Healthcare reform is a different animal. In history, has become known as Hillary Care, rather. The Clinton administration will implement or construct a task force on national health care. Okay, it will be headed by Hillary Clinton. Hillary Clinton has no administrative post in the administration whatsoever. She's not the secretary of anything. She's not in an elected office. She's the first lady. this will become her bailiwick, which is actually one of the reasons that it fails. Okay, nobody has a lot of respect for her as being the first lady to do this. They ultimately will form up the Health Security Act of 1993. And the basic reformation that this is going to institute is mandatory employer health care. Okay, employers will have to give their employees health benefits. Okay, which is going to increase the cost of production, which could be recessionary, etc., etc., etc. Ultimately, it is an unpopular law, and it won't pass through Congress. But this is going to be the first attempt at healthcare reform, okay, which will later be revisited by Obamacare, by the ACA. On to the famous scandals of the Clinton administration. The first is the Whitewater scandal, which breaks in 92 and 94. And the actual operative things that go on here happen before Clinton's president. It's when he's governor and when he's out of office as governor, when he loses the election and then he wins the election again and becomes governor of Arkansas again. But it has to do with an investment corporation, a land development corporation, and there are alleged improprieties in the lending practices that the Clintons get themselves low interest loans with reasonable rates, and they invest them in this Whitewater Development Corporation, which is allegedly kind of a shell corporation for the Clintons and their cohorts to simply launder this money that's being lent and dissipate it. Okay, because ultimately the Whitewater Land Development Corporation fails. Okay, and it's a limited liability corporation, so none of its leadership is held accountable. And so ultimately all this money that's lent to Whitewater never gets paid back. Instead, it gets put in to the various bank accounts of the people involved in the leadership of the Whitewater Corporation, among them being the Clintons. Okay, Ken Starr will lead an independent investigation of this once Clinton becomes president. And the Clintons themselves will be acquitted on all charges. All of their main partners, okay, all of the other guys involved in the corporation will ultimately serve time, okay, but not the Clintons. And a lot of it, and this is why it becomes a scandal, because what Clinton did before he was president is not, punishable while he's president, okay? The problem is that the argument is that while he was governor of Arkansas, he used his influence as governor to facilitate the Whitewater arrangements. And as president, he used his influence as president to interfere with the investigation. Okay, that was the allegation. It was never proven. He wasn't actually brought up on charges on any of this. Okay, but it really stained his reputation. The more significant scandal in which he becomes involved is the one that will bring impeachment proceedings against him. He'll be impeached on 2 impeachable counts. Perjuring himself under oath when he testifies to the grand jury. Clinton will become the first president in U.S. history, and actually the only president in U.S. history, to testify before a grand jury. And using his power as the president to obstruct the investigation. Of course, the specifics of it have to do with the torrid sexual affair he had with Monica Lewinsky, which dominated the news in 95 and 96. I myself couldn't have cared less. I didn't care what he did. I couldn't care less what a president does in their personal life. All I care about is whether or not they're a good captain of the ship. And the fact of the matter is, Clinton was a pretty decent captain of the ship. Okay, at the helm, he was doing okay. Had his problems. We're going to come up, the Balkans crisis was one of them. We have all these different things, right? But as a president goes, he's doing a decent enough job, so I couldn't give a damn what the hell he's doing. Okay? But in terms of the American people, it's a different ballgame. And it surfaces in 95, okay, that Monica Lewinsky, who at the time was an aide for Clinton, had been engaged in a sexual affair with the president in the Oval Office, okay? And it's her friend Paula Jones that brings it up. Now, originally when the story breaks, Clinton denies any knowledge of it. He says that he's never had sexual relations with that woman. that nothing has ever happened. Ultimately, he's going to admit to certain sexual acts, and that's how he's going to back his denial. He's going to say, well, we engaged in certain sexual acts, but that's different than actually having intercourse, which nobody's going to buy. Okay, he's going to reverse himself, and that's where he's going to open himself up to perjury. He goes into the grand jury saying, no, none of this ever happened. Then as evidence mounts against him, he says, whoa, wait a minute. I didn't know what you guys were talking about. I thought you guys were talking, that you guys actually had intercourse. Oh, we never did that. Okay, we committed, other acts. We did oral sex, things like that. Okay, but that's different. That's not the same as sex. And the grand jury just scratches its head and says, Bill, really? This is what you're going to, you're going to sell that argument? That's the story you're going to stick with? Okay? And so that's going to be one of the counts on which he's going to be impeached. The impeachment proceedings will begin in 98. The House will vote to impeach Clinton. Okay, a majority votes to impeach Clinton. The Senate, it's a little bit more difficult. You need a 2/3 majority in the Senate to impeach a president, to remove a president from office. And on the charge of perjury, it'll be 45-55 for impeachment, which means it's defeated. They need 67 votes to impeach him. On the charge of obstruction of justice, it's a 50-50 vote. So again, they lack the sufficient votes to impeach him. He'll become the second president in U.S. history to face impeachment proceedings. He'll become the second president in U.S. history to be acquitted on the charges of impeachment. Now, in conclusion of this rather lengthy lecture and of the Clinton administration, here's the legacy of Clinton. Okay, this is what Clinton's remembered for in history. Welfare reform comes through. Okay, it's the first attempt at healthcare reform. It's economic growth without really the Keynesian model. Instead, he uses the private sector to fuel the economic growth. Okay, his foreign policy initiatives, you know what? I don't know. You agree, you don't agree with his intervention in the Balkans. The fact of the matter is, it was a brilliant move. Not because of what he did. It wasn't a justified move. Okay, one of the things I discovered in my dissertation, which dealt a lot with this stuff, was that all of the actions of a sovereign are justified, and none of the actions of a sovereign are justified. Okay? Whether or not they're justified is irrelevant. What it did was it fundamentally redefined the role of both the United Nations and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization at a time when the North Atlantic Treaty Organization was really threatened by the possibility of the Europeans breaking away and forming their own security force, their own security organization. Okay? This kept the United States in the limelight. This prevented the marginalization of the U.S. Okay? In addition, the Oslo Accords are moribund, but at least they were an introduction of some sort of process. Okay? And so by the end of it, it had become clear to Clinton, for reasons that we talked about, that the U.S. wasn't hegemonic, but it had redefined U.S. foreign policy. And ultimately, I guess what I would say is, this idea of the U.S. being a world policeman was an interesting foreign policy initiative. Okay? Let's look at it. Let's just look at it in the cold light of reason for a minute. From 47 till 91, the defining feature of U.S. foreign policy was given to us by the Truman Doctrine, containment of the Soviet Union. Well, when the Soviet Union's done, what's going to be the basic premise of your foreign policy now? What are you going to do? What's going to be your basic strategic objective? The Clinton administration redefines it. Okay? The U.S. is the world policeman. Now, there are problems with that. Problems that we really didn't get into. Problems that would be more for a course on American foreign policy. Problems related to the idea that, oh, well, it's a policeman in the sense of a small-town cop that selectively enforces the law, when his friends are offended, but doesn't enforce the law universally, etc., whatever. Who cares? It was an interesting perspective. At least he came up with something. Okay? When the Bush administration comes in, they really have nothing to go on until 9/11. And then 9/11 now becomes the strategic objective of U.S. foreign policy, combating what loosely is referred to as terrorism. Okay? So, but when all of that is said and done, Okay, when we look at all of that in the Clinton administration, 10 years of unrelented economic growth, fueled by the private sector, government surpluses, a redefinition of the role of NATO, a reinvigoration of U.S. foreign policy, a redefinition of U.S. All of this gets lost. It gets forgotten. What Clinton is most referred to, what he's mostly remembered for, okay, are the scandals that were involved. Okay? Americans love gossip. And that's what Clinton's remembered for. He's not really even remembered for Whitewater that much. Okay? So he was involved in a crooked kind of quasi-legal land development scheme. You know what? Who wasn't, right? We all been there, done that. Okay, fine. It was the Monica Lewinsky thing. Americans love gossip about sex. And that's what he's remembered for. Okay? Rather than what he did as president. And that's the legacy of Clinton. And that concludes this lecture, which I think now is the lengthiest of the lectures. I'm going to try to keep down the current history one, but who knows? That's current events, so that's going to be ongoing. And we'll move on with that for the final week of class. That'll be in week 15. All right.